So on today's episode of Talking's Not Dead, I talked with my cousin Nicholas. He chose the topic Atlantis, the lost city. A very interesting conversation, not the direction I thought it was going to take. So a couple of heads up about that. We talked about, Atlantis, the history behind it, possible locations, and just kind of the general situation. He did something a little bit different than's been happened before. He brought a PowerPoint presentation for the talk, which I thought was really cool. So there's some nice visuals to go along with it. I do want to remind everybody that no one in these episodes is an expert. So even though we're talking about this, please don't take anything as expert opinion or expert advice on this topic. Let's go ahead and get into it. All right, Nicholas, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining. So you wanted to talk about the lost city of Atlantis.
Yes.
Now, I always ask my guests this. And the first question I wanted to ask you is, why did you choose this topic? What made you want to talk about this above everything else?
So it's something I've kind of gotten into more recently. I'm a history guy. I study history. And so there's been a lot of things like this talking about like the Great Flood in the Bible and other religions, talked about Troy, the lost city of Troy and stuff like that, where these are things that were once thought to be myths, and then all of a sudden we find new evidence, and now they're this real reality, and they're part of history. And Atlantis right now is kind of that in-between phase where it's a myth, but people are starting to find evidence that it's real, and I really like being in the middle of that and doing research and kind of seeing what's going on with that.
Okay, so this is definitely more of a recent adventure for you.
Yeah, probably the last year or so,
Okay,
give or take.
that's cool. So, I guess the real first question that we should answer is, what exactly is Atlantis? What exactly is it?
So one thing that I'm going to show you on here, this is what people kind of think of. You have your Disney movies, your History Channel documentaries, and it's somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. It's something that exists. But again, it's the idea that there was this city or this empire that used to exist, and then it sunk to the bottom of the ocean, and now it's gone. They were very advanced, very technologically superior to all those around them, and then for some reason the ocean just swallowed them up and they're gone. And that's kind of the basic idea that's in people's minds about what Atlantis is. But it's interesting because we actually have a lot of information that Plato gave us that kind of talks about it more in depth that people don't really look at as much.
Yeah, so I know that the myth of Atlantis originated with Plato. He mentions it in two of his dialogues. So, this is the first known record, at least as far as I'm aware. Why do you think it had such a big impact, culturally, societally, for historically for a long time, if it only showed up in these two dialogues?
So what's really interesting about that, I think people have always had this kind of sense of adventure and looking for things that are lost. You have like El Dorado too. Oh, it's a city of gold. You gotta find it. It's somewhere in South America. We gotta look for it. We gotta find it, and then we're gonna be rich. Similar kind of a thing with Atlantis. They're so technologically superior. It's kind of almost a kind of a callback. Almost, it's like, hey, these guys used to be so great. Why do we not have that stuff? What happened to them? And I think that really captures people's imaginations, as well as just curiosity. And it becomes a really interesting story that gets passed down through the generations. And I think certainly as technology has improved and the internet is a thing, I think it's become a lot more popular with movies and again documentaries and stuff, which they're not necessarily fully accurate, but you know what I mean. Kind of propping it up. I think that's the main reason why it's become such a thing now, or it's stayed a thing for so long.
Okay, we'll come back to that kind of idea in a little bit, but you mentioned again that it almost kind of taps into like the human psyche, the human experience, the curiosity, the secret adventure, the longing. But you also mentioned that it gets passed down a lot from like generation to generation. What do you think has changed about the the Atlantis story from its conception from Plato to now? Like, what has changed as it's been passed down from generation to generation?
So again, you have things like the movies and the History Channel documentaries that like to say everything was done by aliens and all that.
Right.
And I certainly think that is a more recent change,
Mm,
kind of the direction that people look at it. But a lot of things too, if you actually read what Plato wrote
mm,
and then compare it to kind of what people's basic ideas were, um, the way Plato describes it, people think it sunk to the bottom of the ocean. Plato suggests that it was swallowed by the ocean, and while
mm,
that's not a huge difference in many people's minds,
mm,
um, the difference between, if you really think about it on a grand scale, some sort of flood coming in and destroying it versus an entire piece of land falling to the bottom of the ocean, it
mm,
actually does
mm.
create quite a big difference
I see.
in how it's viewed. And it's possible discovery again if it were to be a historical fact instead of
Hmm.
fiction.
Yeah, if we were to make that flip there, that's interesting. I'm actually going to come back to that idea in a little bit, but I guess if we're just going to stick with the Atlantis as a story for now, right? We're kind of talking about the Atlantis. The story comes from Plato. What do you think the story of Atlantis tells us? What's the moral of the story?
So what's interesting about that? It actually originates with the Egyptians and then gets passed to Solon, and then he tells Plato, at least so Plato says.
Right.
Um, but what's really, I think, really the kind of the moral of the story at the end, when the Egyptians were sunk, swallowed by the ocean. I'll use the actual
Sure.
terminology. Of course, Plato, makes it more Greek.
Right.
Poseidon into the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah.
And what happens there is, they become wicked and they become very much into money. Money is very important to them, riches, gold.
Hmm.
And again, they become very wicked and kind of drunk with power. And Poseidon basically says, "Hey, that's too much. You're done," and
Hmm.
kind of wipes the slate clean. And you see that similar story in Christianity with God and the flood of Noah.
Hmm.
It's possible that those could be the same event that are being talked about too,
Hmm.
because historically speaking, we do have a lot of similar stories that get passed down as myth that end up having been reality in some sense,
Hmm.
but they get made to be so much bigger um, because of, again, being passed down through generations. And kind of like, our parents say, "Oh, I walked through the snow to get to school,
Yeah.
barefoot through the dinosaur." And obviously that's not the case, but things get exaggerated and
Right.
made more grand as they pass down.
Okay. So again, so if we're talking about like a moral of this story, then is what do you think it is again? You think
So
it's?
then go for it.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just am trying to connect the two ideas here.
Yeah. So I'd say the moral based on that kind of a thought process would be then that, um, you know, money is okay and power is okay and that's great and all, but you let it go to your head and you make it your entire
Mm-hmm.
personality, then that's not a good thing. And so in the particular case of the story, Poseidon comes in and washes,
I see.
as opposed to in a moral sense, you have to be humbled, basically.
Yeah, and those other details, those other kind of irrelevant details seem to be like layered on as time has gone on. As you said, it kind of gets like it gets um more extreme.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I've heard, in reading a little bit about Atlantis and, ideas that are kind of go with it, I've heard that it gets connected with this idea of utopia a lot. What
Hmm.
is your view on utopia, and why do you think it's connected to Atlantis?
So to me, utopia is this ideal, perfect society. Unfortunately, though, because everyone has different ideas, different opinions, utopia is going to be different to every single person.
Hmm.
But that whole the human experience kind of angle with the story,
Hmm.
I think that it's very plausible that you can kind of put your own basic utopia onto Atlantis and then expand the details yourself. You have the idea of this technologically superior society. They had one of the things Plato says is there was a stream of hot water and a stream of cold water that came up in the center of the island.
Mm.
Uh, there's this idea of it's fresh water too, so you have drinking water, hot and cold. You don't have to boil it yourself. You don't have to
Mm.
freeze it. It's
Which is a
right
big
there.
idea at the time, right?
Exactly, yeah, and it's fresh water, so it's drinkable. It's not, the ocean water, river water. You get sick or
Mm-hmm.
dehydrated. It's this the idea of utopia, perfect. Everyone working together and living together in harmony,
Mm-hmm.
all that kind of stuff. Riches, it all kind of that's that basic idea that I think a lot of people put with utopia.
Mm-hmm.
Just, obviously, again, though, politics is a thing and it doesn't really talk about the politics too much
Right.
and stuff like that. So it leaves it kind of open on that end for people to kind of make it their own.
Mm-hmm.
But in general, it's this, it does very much seem like a utopia esque kind of experience for the people that do live there in the story.
And so, if I'm understanding correctly, the idea is that even though they had this utopia, they had, they were not humble within the utopia, right? That's the kind of how we connect the moral to the utopia here. So it was a utopia, but they weren't humble. They weren't, they were beyond their means and all that stuff, and then they were punished in some way, either whether it be through a natural disaster or the gods, as it was in maybe in the original story, whatever it is. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, you have, like you said, it's, you have this perfect society
Mm-hmm.
and you don't appreciate it. You don't
Right.
appreciate the gifts that you've been given, whether by, like you said, the gods, the land, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get humbled.
Yeah.
And, it kind of teaches people. It's kind of like a children's kind of fairy tale where
Yeah.
there's always that message of be careful. If you do this, then this
Right.
happens. And so I think that kind of serves as a warning too, in a way.
Do you think that that message has a lot of connections or things that we can learn about today still?
Absolutely. Especially today, people are very obsessed with money.
Hmm.
I mean, and it's kind of hard not to be.
Right.
Then you think about how expensive things are and how, people talk about all the time, oh, I don't make enough on minimum wage, so I need to get, another job or they need to pay me more so
Right.
that I can live comfortably. And so people become very very much almost idolizing money in a way that
Hmm.
I need to have this. I need to have as much of it as possible.
Right.
You have these millionaire dream home or $1 million dream home shows and stuff
Right.
like that, lottery. It's just very much part of the culture now.
Yeah.
Money is just this. You judge someone's success in life by how much money they had. It seems like.
Right.
And so that still very much applies with this whole, idea of Atlantis and the story
Hmm.
of the idea of, again, having too much, not giving it back, not being humble about it. There's a lot of people, especially the more wealthy people, that do kind of flaunt their money
Hmm.
and don't do anything about it, or say they're going to do something about it and end up not.
Hmm.
And that I think really does speak to the story,
Yeah.
um, and kind of it shows that this is a human problem,
Yeah.
and this is it's everlasting. It doesn't go away.
Do you think that we're gonna have maybe a metaphorical great flood or sinking into the ocean, swallowing into the ocean happen in our current modern story?
I think it's definitely possible.
Hmm.
One thing that's about history, whether it's mythological, because ultimately myth is history. It may
Right.
not be the accurate telling of history, but it shapes people's beliefs, and so it still becomes part of history in a way.
Yeah, yeah, and it was like told by people. You know what I mean? That the fact that it was being verbally or written, told by people, that in itself is a part of the history, even if it's a fiction or
Yeah,
it's a warping of what actually happened.
yeah, exactly. And so with that, I think that it's very possible history does have there are a lot of connections between
Mm-hmm.
things that happened and things that happen all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And you see economic crashes like the Great Depression,
Right.
stuff like that. It wouldn't surprise me if something like that were to happen again, because it just seems like that's the way the cycle goes.
Right.
People are so obsessed with money, they get humbled. Oh, I'm never going to be like that again, and then they start getting things back, and oh, maybe it's okay to an
Right.
extent. And then eventually, you get to the point where people kind of forget about it, and oh, that was such a long time ago. It's never going to happen to me again,
Right.
and it just kind of repeats the cycle.
Yeah, that's fair. So, if we're going to turn our attention back to Atlantis, have there been any searches to find Atlantis throughout history? And are there any notable ones that you want to share with us?
So there have been several attempts throughout history, but they're not very well documented.
Interesting.
Um,
Why
a
is
lot of,
that?
I assume, and I don't know exactly because I
Sure.
wasn't there. I would assume because nothing was found, it's
Mm,
kind of like a moot point. They're like, oh well, you didn't find anything. Oh well,
right.
but good job, but we're not gonna. That's not something we need to record because you have to keep in mind too. Back in those times, there was a literacy and um, reading was a lot lower the rates than it is now.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of times, the wealthy were the only ones who could do that because they could afford to spend the time to learn that stuff. And so,
Hmm.
if it did produce something tangible for them to be like, "Oh wow, this is incredible," then it's kind of gone. And another thing I would bring up is the burning of the Library of Alexandria.
Mm,
There was a lot of documents in there, and it was from the records that we do have still. It was a beautiful library and college. It was just filled with knowledge. But I don't remember which emperor it was specifically. But one of the Roman emperors decided that it needed to be burned down because it was a threat to his power, basically.
right.
And so any information in there was lost because it was all burned to the ground. Back then it wasn't digital, of course. It was all on paper and scrolls and books. And so anything, if there was anything to, any records of an exploration there, they would have been completely destroyed.
Hmm.
Um, but very, very recently, there is a theory that's kind of gaining, not a theory, a hypothesis. I know you're a science guy, so I'll use the proper terms.
Sure. Sure.
There's been a hypothesis as to the location of where Atlantis was.
Hmm.
And there have been actually people who have gone there and looked at it and actually on the ground. And there are some remarkable similarities from what they have found to the story that Plato outlined for us.
Interesting.
Um, it's very interesting. It's actually located from, the current thought process. The most, I'd say, the biggest thought is that it's in Africa, actually.
Interesting. So,
And
oh, sorry. Go for it.
no, no, go for it. You're good.
I was just gonna say, do you want to walk me through kind of like where people thought it was? Because as I understand it, people thought it's been a couple different places. So where people thought it was in the past, and they now, I guess, lead me up to this Africa idea.
So one of the things Plato talks about in his telling of Atlantis, and I'm going to skip through some stuff.
Sure.
I'm going to go right here, just beyond the Pillars of Hercules.
Oh, I'm
Now,
not seeing that slide.
you're not seeing that slide?
No, I'm seeing what you have, the first slide.
Oh, you're still seeing the first? Interesting. What if I do this? That's why. Yep. Can you see it now?
Yes.
So yeah, just beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which if you don't know what that is, it's the Strait of Gibraltar, and if you don't know what that is, that's going to be this little area right here
Okay.
in between the Horn of Africa and the bottom of Iberia.
Okay.
And so it has to be west of this, and so people would often think, oh, well, surely if it's west of that, it must be somewhere out here, Atlantis out here in the ocean,
I see.
um, Atlantic Ocean,
Right.
Atlantis. Wow,
I
it
see.
sounds similar. And so people have thought, it's got to be somewhere under the ocean out there. Maybe it was a sunken continent, as
Mhm.
this picture kind of shows. Maybe it was a sunken island or city. Um, or at one point, too, it was actually believed that Atlantis was somewhere in the Americas once they
Mhm.
were rediscovered.
Interesting.
Because, of course, it's this new land. We're rediscovering, this land. It's brand new territory. We thought it was India. It's not.
It seems like it
Well,
lines up a little bit. Yeah.
yeah, it's west. It lines up, so maybe it's here somewhere. Maybe, and there's actually there's this area around here ish called the Bimini Road. I want to say
Okay.
that is this road-looking structure under the water, and there's statues and stuff down there
Mm-hmm.
around Florida and Cuba ish.
Okay.
And people kind of, in more recent times, people have thought, oh, well, maybe that's it. It's underwater. It fits all the, the descriptions. maybe that's part of it, but it's been underwater for such a long time. It's eroded. We can't really tell. Um, and so those are kind of some of the big ideas. A lot of the time, it was just it's somewhere in the ocean. Maybe it's in the British Isles,
Hmm.
but never really anything super duper concrete
Sure.
in that regard, as far as records show.
Right.
Um, but the Africa theory has been gaining a lot of traction recently because of this particular. Let me just show you here. This thing called the Recot structure,
Hmm.
or the Eye of the Sahara. It's
Okay.
located here. So this is modern day Mauritania.
Hmm.
So it's on the western coast of Africa. The Pillars of Hercules, as they were, are about right here.
Okay.
So it's just west. And then again, it has this ring structure to it. And when Plato described it, one of the things he described, it's composed of 5 rings, 3 of water and 2 of land. And so then you have this middle bit that's a kind of an island,
Hmm.
these 2 rings of land and 3 of water.
Interesting.
And then when you look at the structure here, you can see that there could be 1, 2 right here, and then there's actually a third bit out here that it's just not showing on this picture. But so there would be 3 rings of water and then 2 of land.
Interesting.
Um,
Okay.
Obviously, of course, it's kind of difficult to say because there's no buildings there.
Right.
If there was something there tangible, boom, Atlantis, no problem. There's nothing there. So, we can't really just go for it and say.
Hmm.
But what's interesting about it too, that people have kind of been piecing together recently, this is a map by Herodotus, the first kind of the father of history, as he's called.
Hmm.
Um, and the reason I included this, because right here, I don't know if you can see it, but circled, it says Atlantis.
Oh, interesting.
And right here is the Atlas Mountains,
Hmm.
and then the Atlantic Ocean, obviously, right here, and then Atlantes. One thing Plato described is that Atlantis was bigger than Libya, which is Africa at the time. Africa in the known world at that time, they called it Libya,
Hmm.
and then Asia Minor, which is modern day Turkey.
Oh, interesting.
So the thought is, because people always think, the lost city of Atlantis, the thought is that Atlantis was actually an empire.
Mm.
And one thing that the Egyptians had told Solon is that they were actually a part of the empire. They were kind of a colony of the Atlantean Empire before they were on their own, before it sank,
Hmm.
or disappeared, whatever you want to call it. And so it creates kind of an interesting. The evidence seems to sort of line up with it.
Hmm.
And I mentioned Mauritania, that's where this Recot structure is. And the reason I did that, a couple other facts about Atlantis. The first king was named Atlas, like those mountains that were
Right.
shown in the picture. And the buildings were made of red, white, and black stones.
Hmm.
And Mauritania, their first king was also named Atlas. And their buildings in modern day, some of their buildings in more local villages are made with these red, white, and black stones, and they're found
Interesting.
everywhere in Mauritania.
Hmm.
Um, this structure also, interestingly enough, they have found whale bones, salt deposits, and all sorts like that, suggesting that at one point there was water there. And because they're so close to the surface, it would suggest that that wasn't that long ago in
Mm.
relative terms. Now, one thing that's kind of difficult to tackle is the idea that this is clearly not at the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah. Maybe one
Clearly, it's not.
clear problem.
Yeah, and so people say, "Oh, well, Atlantis, it was swallowed up by the ocean. It sunk into the ocean, whatever you want to call it. Why is this still above the ocean and not below if it really is Atlantis?"
Mm.
And for that, I would draw your attention over here to the this idea of the Trans-Saharan Seaway, which used to exist before the time of Atlantis. But I'll tell you why that's relevant in a minute. But you can see that the water clearly did come in, but the structure's over here.
Mm.
So that doesn't really help us. But you can see with these arrows here, I took this actually from a YouTube video of a YouTuber that was talking about it. You can see kind of this path that water seems to have kind of taken through Africa
Mm.
if there was some sort of, this flood that happened, and the structure is right here. So the path
Mm.
clearly goes through. And again, if you look like right here, you see this wavy kind of texture on the sand,
Mm-hmm.
and as if water kind of pushed through. And another thing that's kind of interesting is that only about 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was green.
Mm.
It wasn't this desert that we know it as today. So, because obviously, also Atlantis being in the middle of the desert, I mean, come on.
Right.
But if it was green and the time that Atlantis would have existed based on Plato's numbers, if I go here, 9,000 years before the birth of Solon, which in today's terms is about 11,653 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that lines up with this timeline of when the Sahara was green.
Right.
So obviously that solves kind of that problem, and it brings us closer to that utopia idea, right? Because it's
Right.
green. And the structure is right here in red. You can't see it on this map because an artist rendition, but
Right. Right. Right.
and you can see there's a lot more water in here too because there used to be. But then there's this obvious problem again. That's great, but how did we get from Atlantis being here in the Green Sahara to water flowing all over it and causing problems?
Mm-hmm.
And that comes from there's this thing that's a recent discovery called the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe. It happened from about 12,900 to 11,600 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
which again falls in line roughly with our timeline of when Atlantis would have existed.
Right.
And basically, what the theory is, and we've taken ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, um, a comet must have exploded above or impacted somewhere that we haven't found yet.
Mm.
And it melted these ice sheets considerably, a lot faster than they were melting previously.
Mm-hmm.
And the sea levels rose some 400 feet in a very short amount of time. And I'm not talking instantly, but it's in the course of months or a year or two.
Mm-hmm.
Water rising that quickly is going to cause a lot of problems. I mean, people,
Yeah.
you talk about climate change today, and people are worried that the sea level is rising and it's going to cause a bunch of devastation for the people that live on the coast. Well, this is that, but like 300 times magnitude. So
Right.
it causes significant issues. And so if that is the case, and that evidence does suggest that it is,
Mm-hmm.
then it's very plausible to suggest that because this existed at one point, these areas are going to be lower. And then with the water having been right about here-ish, instead of going like this, it kind of goes over and out.
Interesting.
And so at this point, the problem that this really poses, and it's going to be very difficult for anyone who believes in this theory to find concrete evidence that this was truly the place of Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
If water was rushing through at the speeds we're talking, and this is so barren like it is, where are all the buildings? Where is any evidence at all of Atlantis?
Right.
And that is going to be probably somewhere in the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a sense, it did sink to the bottom of the ocean.
Right.
But so then now the task that people who are researching this theory, especially in a very serious method, is going to be how do you find that evidence and bring it back to the surface and say, hey, look, this is part of Atlantis because X, Y, and Z.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the biggest challenges as an archaeologist in general is how do you connect piece A over here to piece B over here and make a cohesive story that's plausible and believable.
Right.
And that's going to be the real problem here that I see. Because I personally, I think that this is a very likely candidate for Atlantis. I think it makes a lot of sense. But because of the lack of buildings, the lack of records, it's going to be very difficult to make that concrete.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that is tough. Because especially if you're like looking at this, you know what I mean? It's like what you're saying. I mean, it sounds like it does kind of paint a pretty cohesive picture. But then the only question you ask is, well, where is? Especially if they were supposed to be like this like gigantic empire, you know what I mean? Like, they were supposed to be expansive, gigantic, larger than life almost. Is like you got to find a drop of something somewhere.
Exactly. And that's, I think, the big thing is going to be looking around Africa, specifically where it was green.
Mm-hmm.
Because Africa, while we know a lot about it, especially with like the Sahara, it's very difficult because of all the sand, because it's
Yes.
so and dense. It's hard to find things. And
Yes.
so I feel like there could be a lot of things, a lot of human history that we do find in this area, the Sahara,
Yeah.
that we just haven't looked at yet.
And it's not uncommon actually for, lost cities to eventually either turn up, very almost randomly, or
Uh-huh.
for them to like, for them to be lost for long periods of time. You know what I mean? Like, it, the problem with Atlantis, I almost think, is how popular it is. You know what I mean? Like,
Uh-huh.
there are plenty of historical times where there's been like a city that like they just gets discovered. They're like, we didn't know there was a city here, and then it gets discovered like not too long ago. You know what I mean? There's plenty of examples of that happening. You find something and you're like, wow, there was a city here, or you're like, wow, there's a city that we just don't know where it is, and then eventually you find it and it's not where you thought it was. So, I mean,
Oh yeah,
it's not like out of the complete ordinary for something like this to happen.
absolutely. Yeah, and one thing that's, talking about cities that were found, this kind of goes with it, but kind of doesn't. It's the same general time period. There's a site called Göbekli Tepe
Mm-hmm.
in Turkey that's actually 12,000 years old as far as we found. It goes down deeper and they're still digging and excavating to see how far it goes. But
Mm-hmm.
there's complex stone pillars that have carvings in them, like animals and
Mm-hmm.
stuff, based your basic kind of pictograms or
Right.
hieroglyphic kind of images.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that predates the Sumerians, which are thought to be, or the Mesopotamians rather, which are thought to be, the birth of civilization. That predates them by 6,000 years. And
Yeah.
Atlantis similarly would predate them by about 6,000 years. And so it becomes even more hard too, because we don't have any written records older than the Mesopotamians. And
Right.
so you have to, as a archaeologist, as a historian, you kind of have to you have to find workarounds to find, like, again, finding this city. We know it existed, but we don't
Right.
know anything about people that lived there. We don't know anything about, what they did, what the site was used for. A lot
Mm-hmm.
of times when archaeologists or historians don't know what a site was used for, it's a religious site.
Right.
Stonehenge, we don't know what it was used for. It was religious
Right.
and stuff like that. And that does, to me, that does a really big disservice, because you in a way it's kind of disrespectful to the people that
Mm.
built it. I mean, you talking about something that old, you don't know what they were thinking when they built it.
Mm-hmm.
And with it being so intricate, it's kind of difficult to just chalk it up to, oh, they were primitive, they were less advanced than us, so obviously it has to be religious, because anything less advanced than us has to be religious.
Right.
And that's, I think, a problem that will start to emerge more if we do start to find evidence of Atlantis, is this idea of, well, they were more primitive than us, so obviously, since they're older, they had to be more primitive. So
Right.
this can't be what we think it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that's kind of, again, a disservice to the people that do these things.
Yeah, that's fair. So I had a question that
Yes.
I don't know if is actually even relevant anymore because of the way that you've kind of tackled this, which is not necessarily how I expected it. But one thing that comes up pretty often when you talk about people that say, well, Atlantis could never have existed, is they talk about the fact that, with our understanding of plate tectonics nowadays, you couldn't just lose a continent. You know what I mean? Because a lot of times when talk about, it was a large piece of land or a continent that sunk into the ocean. And then again, it's like, well, that just can't happen because of the way we understand plate tectonics, right? The first picture you showed. And I was going to ask you, I was like, well, how do you deal with that? And it sounds like you deal with that by it not being a continent. You deal with it by being a part of an established continent and having some sort of flood or other catastrophe swipe through.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is always possible that this is not the actual place, and just so
Sure.
happens to be something that kind of lines up in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, and let's say, theoretically it was a continent, plate tectonics, there are different boundaries, different types
Mm-hmm.
of interactions with the plates. And so you do see sometimes, one plate getting swallowed under another.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're talking 12,000 years ago, it is very, very highly, highly unlikely that anything like this size, obviously,
Right.
could be just gone that quickly.
Yeah.
And so then you have to, if that's the case, and you want to present it that way, you have to come up with a reason as to why it happened that fast.
Right.
Was there some sort of geothermal activity that happened that caused things to speed up?
Mm-hmm.
Was there like you talk about, which I don't have a picture of it. I wasn't gonna like Zealandia. I don't know if you've ever heard about that.
Mm-mm.
Zealandia, it's New Zealand, right?
Yeah.
So Zealandia, and actually, I'm gonna see if I can't pull up a picture. Um, if it even shows it, actually, it probably won't. Basically, New Zealand, if you look at it on a map, underneath it, you see um, the rest of the sunken continent underneath it.
Mm.
Um, and you can see that it was at one point, it was an actual continent, but the majority of it, except for the high mountainous regions, sunk under the water.
Right.
So I don't know. Can you see my Google right now?
No, I'm just looking at your PowerPoint.
Okay. So let me see. It doesn't matter. Um, actually, oh, you know what? I can do it on here. If I go to insert and then pictures, online pictures, that might work. Can you see me like looking it up?
I cannot see you looking it up, but
But I can put it on the PowerPoint.
yeah, I was gonna say if you put it on PowerPoint, I should be able to see it because I think it just captures the window. Anything that's not
Yeah.
within the window, it will not capture.
Let's see here. There, that's a perfect picture. That's what I wanted. So that's New Zealand. And you can see clearly underneath, you see these little islands that pop up. You see the structure. There was at one point something there.
I see what you're saying. So you have these like little like faded lines on the outside that kind of show like
Yeah.
it could have been more up if the sea level was lower, for example, but it's just kind of there only a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yeah. And back during the Ice Age, the sea levels were lower because so much of the water was frozen. And this was largely above the water, above sea level. But then with different natural disasters and such as flooding from the ice melting
Right.
and earthquakes and stuff like that, a lot of it, other than the main really tall parts,
Right.
sunk under the ocean. And so, and technically anything is west of, anything, because the way that kind of works, you could
Right.
go west forever, but you can't go north or south forever.
Right.
So theoretically, I mean, for all we know, this could be Atlantis. I mean, I'm not saying it is, but sunken continent, and maybe that's worth exploring. But
Interesting.
the point being, kind of that, this kind of gives some points to your question. This is still here.
Right.
We can clearly see this.
Right.
And so the idea that it was a continent that sunk under the water and is just gone now, to me, is very unlikely.
Right.
It would take a lot of evidence to convince me that that somehow happened.
I
But
see. Yeah.
I'm definitely open to people taking a stab at it and trying. I
Yeah.
mean, anything that brings us closer to the truth and gives me new history to study and teach about when I get to that point, I'm
Yeah.
all for it.
There you go.
So yeah, if people can find that, then that's great. But I don't think it's anything in the realm of possibility.
So I talked to one of my other friends, Rexton, on a podcast a few episodes ago. I don't remember which episode it was at this point, but he was talking about the state of academia for non-STEM majors, and he's going to go get a history degree, similar to you actually. He's going to school for that. He's actually I think he's a junior, so about where you're at. And we ended up having a very interesting conversation, and one of the things that he brought up was that there's a problem with academia where there's more people getting higher degrees than there are jobs.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that he saw as both a problem and a good thing about that is that what's kind of caused that is the rise of the internet and the interconnectivity. And, he made the point that, a lot of times history was only able to be done by highly trained individuals. And a lot of times to get a full history degree, like a PhD in history, you had to like travel to places to get the history degree that you're doing. If you're going to get a PhD in the history of Britain, you needed to go to Britain for years to do that. And that was a high barrier to entry. And the point he made was that, nowadays, if you wanted to do a lot of these things like the internet, the connectivity, you may not need to travel. If you travel, it doesn't have to be for very long. It's made it more easy to access the information and for more people to get into history, which is, again, like he was saying, the main reason, or one of the reasons that there's more people getting these higher degrees than there are jobs, which is not part of our conversation. But what I wanted to ask you was, do you feel, again, someone who is big into history, someone who enjoys all this stuff, do you see that where like more people are getting into history because there's more information that can be shared? It's at the touch of your fingertips. And also, a second question here is, do you see more dissenting opinions about historical facts being raised because of the fact that there are more people being able to see the information, take a stab at it? That was something that he mentioned, was that more people are making more I don't want to use the word outlandish, but different opinions than what was the norm.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm actually gonna move this over if I can. Um, the internet is a huge thing. Also, television. I mean, this is from, I don't remember which one, but it's from one of those History Channel
Hmm.
documentaries
Right.
talking about, it could even be from Ancient Aliens for all I know. But you have, with access to the internet, with access to television in the way that we do, especially at a young age,
Right.
I was watching history documentaries and stuff from a very young age. And that's not something that you would see even 100 years ago.
Right.
In order to do that, you'd have to sit and read the books, the books that were written by these people that, to your point, had to go through all of these challenges to get to this point. So they're very academic sounding, and quite honestly, a lot of them can be very boring.
True.
And so it makes it, where something like Ancient Aliens, one thing that I do actually very much love about that show, which is one of few things, is the idea that they do still talk about history and they do still bring up a lot of relevant and good things about history. They just say that aliens are the reason that it happened.
Right.
But they still do talk about some of these topics, including Atlantis at one point. I know that they did bring it up and things like that. And for someone who's young and impressionable watching this kind of a thing, wow, that's so cool. I want to be like that. Obviously,
Right.
Indiana Jones is a huge thing too. Finding that, kind of like we talked about at the beginning, finding that lost city, that lost
Yeah.
something or other, and a lot of people becoming famous
Right.
is a big thing for a lot of people. I want to be the person that finds this, and my name will be remembered forever. There'll be statues of me. It's this great thing. So a lot of people have that kind of thought process too. So yeah, I definitely think that the internet has made it a lot easier,
Yeah.
but not as easy as it necessarily could be. There are still a lot of. I was actually just talking with my professor about this in class right before we started this. He is a medieval culture specialist. He deals in the medieval period and the pre-medieval period, sort of the
Right.
fall of Rome to the Reformation area.
Sure.
And he said that a lot of people, it's very hard to get into this because everything is in Latin or Greek. And
Yeah.
so you have to know those languages.
That's actually
And
something that
so,
he mentioned too. I would not have thought of. He said that he's actually currently, to be more competitive, to get a degree, a higher education degree in history, he's also taking a language course, because a lot of times you need a language to learn about the history that speaks or had that language.
and one thing that's interesting that I wasn't thinking about talking about at all today, but since you brought this up, it's kind of perfect, is AI and how that's changing the game, kind of. With AI, even with Google Translate at this point, I can turn on Google Translate, get my camera and put it on something in a different language, and it will translate it for me in real time, surprisingly pretty accurately.
Yeah.
And so that is opening up the floodgates too, more so to make it more easy. But at this point, that is still kind of that competitive, like he kind of said, a competitive edge is knowing the language of the place you're going to,
Right.
because you can look at things in a quicker manner, as opposed to
Having to
um,
do the extra step to
having
translate it.
yeah,
Yeah.
at your fingertips. And so I do think that definitely as technology does continue to improve, that we will see an even grosser expansion of people being into these more historical,
Hmm.
archaeological,
Hmm.
paleontology. I don't know how you
Yeah.
would say that.
Paleontological? I'm not sure.
Sure. These kind of fields, because it
Yeah.
becomes a lot easier with technology to help you. I mean, you think about like paleontology, having to go out into the field and find, dinosaur bones, for instance, and sitting there and just mining through rock and dust
Right.
you get machinery that can help you lift these things and do these things, and
Mm.
that's helpful. Then you get MRIs and stuff like that that help you scan these bones and find more information. And some of these things you can extract DNA and look at the DNA and how that happens. And it makes it a lot easier, which is good for everyone because it definitely makes it so that these things are being looked at more and being investigated. But if you're someone like me or like him that wants to be a part of this field and do things with it, it makes it a lot more challenging because suddenly you are just some regular guy from a small town that wants to be, he wants to study, I don't know, ancient Roman pitchforks. I don't know. Why
Yeah.
not? Um, well, then there's 20 others of you that want the exact same thing. And so how do you make yourself stand out? How do you get a job as opposed to these other people? And learning the language is still, kind of an important thing. Definitely background in it. Because I mean, obviously, you want to take it, there's a lot of, if you have connections, that's still a thing. I mean, word of mouth is a huge thing still. So obviously that would, be important, but there's a lot less ways to make yourself stand out.
Yeah.
And that creates problems because then it's almost, at the whim of whatever, which one of these 20 people do I pick? Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, this one.
Right. It's tough.
And yeah, and so it makes it a lot more difficult, especially since some people just see it as money. It's easy. It's history. All I have to do is remember things.
Right.
And people just see it as a way to make quick money, easy money, and they don't necessarily care about it in the way that it should be cared about. There's this Egyptologist from Egypt that he actually ended up selling a lot of Egyptian artifacts on the black market. And he obviously was booted from that,
Right.
but now he gives tours. So he still makes money off of it. But again, to him, he doesn't do it because he loves Egyptian history and wants to share it with people. He does it because he wants to make money and it's easy.
Yeah.
And that's, I think we're going to start seeing a lot more of that as it becomes easier for people to do, which is really very unfortunate. But what can you do?
I want to go back to the second part of my question because I'm actually really curious about your point. So, so with the rise of the internet, do you think that you've seen more dissenting opinions on various historical or interpretations? Because that's something that he mentioned was that because there's more access to evidence, there's more access to interpretations. Do you see that? And would you say that that's maybe one of the reasons that Atlantis has seemed like a bit of a rebirth recently, like the search?
I would say, yeah, definitely. Even before the internet, you kind of still in this more modern of a time. You see, like even things with like the Civil War, you go from 500,000 Americans died to almost 900,000 died just because of new evidence that comes to light.
Right.
Because technology makes it easier to find. And so with Atlantis, certainly YouTube is a huge thing. People, watch YouTube, people watch podcasts,
Right.
people do all that kind of stuff. And so one person starts talking about this and all of a sudden, that's interesting. And so people start looking up things. You can look up that the first king of Mauritania was named Atlas, simply, doing a quick Google search.
Right.
You can look up Poseidon's first son was named Atlas, doing a quick Google search. And then Atlantis, you can look it up. And so in 3 minutes, you have compiled a list of evidence.
Right.
And that's not something you could do before. You'd have to go through an entire book, find this one piece, then go to an entirely different book, hope that it's available somewhere near you. And finally, compile all this, and then here is my hypothesis. And so you do definitely see a lot of connections being made between things that don't necessarily have connections. And that's where you kind of get those ideas of like pseudo history, pseudo science that kind of pop up because a lot of people, again, talking about Atlantis and the whole story and the Egyptian thing I mentioned, people like money. People want people to like them. And with YouTube, you make a snappy title and you do something
and
that's
sometimes the truth isn't always as interesting as a story you could tell.
Absolutely. You look at the news. You don't ever hear, this little girl saved 5 people. You hear 400 people dead in a flood after mysterious blah blah. You always hear these things because it gets people's attention. It's
Right.
like, oh hey, I want to watch this, and it
Hmm.
makes them more money. And so yeah, YouTube has really done that, and I love YouTube. I watch it every day and watch videos on it, and a lot of historical videos I'll watch on it.
Hmm.
But it would be foolish and arrogant to say that people don't abuse it to make money too.
Right.
And so you have to be very careful when you do look into stuff on YouTube, on TV with ancient aliens and things like
Right.
that. Because just because something's being presented to you as fact doesn't mean that it is. And just
Right.
because people draw comparisons doesn't mean it's fact either. Like there was a documentary which kind of speaks exactly to what you're talking about. There's a documentary on National Geographic or something like that
Mm.
about mermaids and about how they're real.
Is that the April Fool's one?
Yes,
Yeah, I
they.
saw that on television, and I remember I was pretty young, and I thought
Yep,
that mermaids were real
me too.
for like half a day until I think it was my mom, or maybe it was my dad. I forget. One of them was like, "Son, they're not real."
Well, my mom and I watched it together, and they even had convinced her because the evidence they said this is all true stuff.
Yeah.
They documented it and presented it on the commercials and stuff as being truth.
Right.
They bring up things like the aquatic ape hypothesis and
Yeah.
explain what that is, and they say it in such a way that yeah, it sounds
And they
plausible.
had pretty intense graphics, if I'm remembering correctly, too. Like the
Absolutely, yeah.
reenactments and stuff. I was like, they were like trying to go for it.
Yeah, and so you get this idea that oh, this must be real until you start doing the research for yourself, which is always hugely important. If you're ever any decision you make, any thing you listen to and you want to know if it's real or not, always do your own research
Hmm.
because anyone will say anything they want if it makes them happy or if that's what they believe. Because
Hmm.
for all you know, this person, which obviously wasn't the case, but this person who made this documentary about mermaids thought it was real and really did believe what they were saying.
Right.
But again, all of the evidence suggests the complete opposite.
Right.
And so you have to be able to do your own research. And I think that's something important for people in general to know how to do.
Hmm.
But anyway, but so in doing research, the aquatic ape hypothesis basically says, oh, look, there's webbing right here. We must have come from the water at some point. Maybe trying to get crabs made us grow webbing on our fingers.
Right.
And so it sounds great on paper, and you can say snazzy words and buzzwords and stuff like that to make people think ooh ah, but it's not something that's true and accurate. And a lot of times people will use science to prove their historical inaccuracies.
I see. Interesting.
um, yeah, it's like one huge example of that that we saw a lot in Europe, unfortunately, is the idea of European superiority during the time of the slave trade. Uh,
Mm.
During that time, African Americans weren't just seen as, or not African Americans, Africans in general, weren't just seen as another race of humans. They were
Hmm.
seen as a completely different species of human that
Hmm.
was inferior in every way. And it makes it very easy to justify something like slavery if you think, oh, well, these people are completely inferior. They're made for me to enslave. That's their purpose.
Right.
Okay, sound, whatever. But then you think about it logically.
Yeah, and then you realize that that's just a way
Yeah,
of convincing yourself.
exactly. In reality, what had happened is these European powers had guns. The African kingdoms didn't. The Europeans came over and said, hey, we'll give you guns for your prisoners. And they're like, oh, hey, we use them for slave labor. You can do that too. That's great. Thank you. They start doing that and say, hey, these slaves are pretty good, but I don't want to continue to have to give things for it. I'm just going to establish a colony and then I can take as many of them as I want for free.
Which is awful.
Yeah, but with Darwinism being a thing that starts up around the same time, and the
Mhm.
idea of evolution that
Mhm.
wasn't really heard of until then,
Mhm.
all of a sudden it becomes, oh, well, they're not as evolved as me. That's why it's
Right.
so easy to take them and do things to them because they're not as capable as I am. When in reality, a lot of times, because of the environment of Africa, many Africans are much more equipped for the world, more strong, faster, and sometimes even smarter, and a lot of times smarter
Mhm.
than many Europeans. It's just because of the nature of the Sahara Desert, especially,
Mhm.
there's a lot of disconnect, and so those ideas weren't able to spread like they are in the Eurasian
Mm.
sphere. And so it's much less a thing of superiority as it is of simple circumstance.
Right.
And especially going tying it back together, if Atlantis is in Africa, they were supposedly the richest, most intelligent, empire in the world at the time.
Right.
That originates in Africa.
Yeah.
So this almost would be like a nail in the coffin for anyone else who kind of has that thought process of almost white superiority, honestly. And
Yeah.
that's not something I again was thinking about talking about, but
We kind of landed here.
yeah, it kind of fits.
Yeah.
It's I mean, if this were green, like it says, like it's supposed to have been, there would have been the influx and trade of ideas
Mhm.
and things like that. Communication and transportation would have been a lot easier, and so you see more farming too, and much
Yeah.
more ability to feed people. And what we see historically is as the ability to make food gets easier,
Mhm.
new ideas pop up.
Yeah.
That's always,
Stability. Yeah.
yeah. What you don't have to worry about farming, you can think about other things.
Right.
Sometimes that turns into philosophy.
Sometimes.
Sometimes that turns into industrial revolutions.
Yeah, you never know.
um,
You got some options.
yeah, it's certain things, and not to say that either is more important than the other,
Sure.
but certain times people just get these ideas and they take off and explode and rapidly change the course of history.
Mhm.
And so to me, honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if this whole Atlantis theory being in Africa is correct.
Right.
It wouldn't surprise me to say that maybe they had certain technologies that even we have today at their
Mm.
disposal. It's just in a different form.
I see.
In about this area in the Mediterranean, there was a device called the Antikythera mechanism that
Mm.
was found there. It was a Greek device, and it was used as a calculator,
Interesting.
a computer calculator. Not just like you move these many beads over and these many, and it makes. It was actually like it could compute and dispense numbers based on what you put in.
Interesting.
That existed like 2,000 years ago.
Right.
But the thing is, that's what was important to them at the time was math and discovering this. And so
Right.
they make advancements that help them to, get there. Well, then it gets lost for whatever reason, especially like again, the burning of the Library of Alexandria. We don't know what was in there.
Mhm.
And so it's possible that there was certain technologies that we have today that we are rediscovering,
Right.
but they existed before. And that becomes a slippery slope for what you were talking about. The people could say, "Oh, well, they had forklifts and spaceships back
Yeah.
when we forgot how to make them, and now we're just now finding it again. And so we're going to go to Mars and see that there was humans all over Mars, but then they all died, and now it's just
There's a line between genuine inquiry and crazy skepticism or crazy outlandish theories.
absolutely." And the problem is with the internet, the line starts to blur.
Yeah. Especially
People
with how it's
present it
framed.
exactly the way people present it. It can sound very logical. Those YouTube Shorts,
Oh
TikTok,
yeah, they'll get you. They'll get you because they implant you with a minute of information and you think you forget about it, but it's in your subconscious. You remember it.
absolutely, and they don't have to be true at all. They don't have to.
No.
There's no censorship of them, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, but it means you have to be careful.
You have to be careful.
And that I think is something that as technology does improve, like you were asking, I definitely think that's going to be a much bigger problem
Hmm.
and continue to be a problem for as long as we have the technology. Because again, if who's to say we didn't have computers 2,000 plus years ago, but we lost the technology for it.
Sure.
And you know, some similar things were happening. We don't know. And so I definitely see that though as a problem that will continue to become worse.
Hmm.
And without flat out just censoring people and telling them that they can't say this or can't say that, which I personally am against,
Hmm.
I don't know how you really solve that issue
Hmm.
other than telling people, teaching people how to do their own research and how to find out if something is factual or not.
Well, that might be a discussion for another podcast because I think that may be beyond the scope of this conversation. So maybe we could have you back on for something like that. I have
Yeah,
two more
definitely.
questions I want to finish off with today. Um,
Perfect.
so why is it you think, so if we're kind of tying it back to Atlantis here, why is it you think that Atlantis is so pervasive in pop culture today? Why do you think that it's something that comes up a lot?
So I think it's kind of, in a way, it's kind of like the story of the hero's journey that gets
Mm.
passed on continuously. Not to say that Atlantis is a story of that,
Sure.
but it's the idea that it captures people's imagination and they retell it and retell it and retell it. I mean, you see that now. Everything is getting rebooted all of a sudden.
Right.
Everything, we have to make a new movie with new people because we just have to. People are going to love it.
Right.
And I think that's kind of something that happens with Atlantis a lot too, is people get the itch. Kind of like when you want to play a video game and you're like, oh, I
Hmm.
haven't played this in forever. And you play it for 2 weeks and then say, oh, that's right. That's why I don't play it anymore. Not to say that Atlantis isn't interesting, but I feel like that's what happens with a lot of people that aren't
Mm.
genuinely like invested in it. They're just kind of like, oh, this is really cool. I want to look at this. I want to do things with it. And then, oh, yeah, okay. And then they get back into it. Oh, let me look at this again. Let me make a movie about it. Let me, make a documentary about whatever.
Right.
And then, and especially if things stay stagnant and there are no
Hmm.
new discoveries, it's very easy to say, well, let me make a new version of it. There's nothing different about it, but it brings it back to people's attention. And
Right.
I think that's a big reason, is just that people say they don't like repetition, but humans in general, we love repetition, even if it's not something that people like individually saying the same thing over and
Sure.
over again. The repetition of ideas is really what makes one of the biggest things that sets humans apart from other animals on the planet.
Hmm.
Is we have the ability to repeat ideas, and I think that in our brain it almost becomes kind of synonymous with being a human.
Right.
And so we kind of feel a need to repeat the same ideas in different ways, to keep them relevant.
Well, Nicholas,
Yes, sir.
the big question for you then, sir.
Absolutely.
Do you think that we will ever find Atlantis? Not maybe within our lifetime, but do you think we will?
I do. I think that there have been so many different, to your point, so many different discoveries of cities that were lost or that we didn't even know existed, throughout history. And supposedly, especially if scientific this hypothesis is to believe the Sahara will be green again.
Mm.
And if that ever does happen, it'll be a lot easier to find things
Mm.
because all of a sudden you're not looking through the sand, you're looking through grasslands, maybe even
Right.
forest. But technology, by the time it gets to that point, it'll be a lot easier to find things in that way. And as you get things like LiDAR and stuff like that, where you can scan things that you couldn't see with your
Mm.
your eyes on the surface, I think it is very likely that we will find something to call Atlantis. It might not even necessarily fully be Atlantis, but I think we will find something close enough that we can definitely say, hey, this is Atlantis as far as we're concerned, and have a nice day. I think that
Yeah.
that's very, very possible, and honestly probable,
Hmm.
because based on the story that has been presented by Plato, he was told this by Solon, who was told it by the Egyptians, who said it was a true story, and it was, they were a part of it, and they broke off once it kind of collapsed because of the capital city is just demolished by huge waves.
Right.
I don't see, and not to say that they necessarily were lying, would lie about it, but I don't see a reason for them to lie about that.
Right.
I think if that's kind of their oral tradition, there's got to be something to it.
Mm.
And if that is the case, I don't see why we couldn't find it.
Well, Nicholas, thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it, and I'd love to do it again sometime.
Of course, we'll have to make it happen.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everyone for listening to me.